It may surprise you to hear that pretty much everyone who speaks English today is using a variety of English which evolved from one specific region of England. If you're American, if you're speaking English as a second language, yes, that includes you too, probably. The dialect I'm referring to, and the one I'm speaking right now, emerged from a historical region known as the East Midlands. As I said, most people speak this variety of English, but not everyone. So who doesn't? If you come from the north of England, or Scotland, or Ireland, you don't. And confusingly, those from the East Midlands. Today on Let Them Talk TV, we're going to look at how one variety of English got chosen as the standard and was then exported around the world. It's a story that stretches back over 1,000 years. It's fascinating stuff, I promise you. So if you're interested in the history of the English language, then stay tuned. So the East Midlands variety is the written form for everyone in the English-speaking world and the spoken form for most people. First and foremost, we need to talk about the East Midlands. In modern times, this is the East Midlands. It includes the cities of Derby, Leicester, Nottingham, Mansfield, Northampton, and it sounds like this.
Yearishly. And I'm from Derby, a place called Ulverston. I love it, now that I'm not there anymore.
This is definitely East Midlands English, except when it definitely isn't. Let me unravel the confusion. Historically, the map of England has been drawn and redrawn over the centuries. This is a map of the Heptarchy and the 7 counties of that period, which were divided along tribal lines, and these still echo in the accents across England to this day. Modern linguists have drawn maps of the dialects of Middle English, and this map here shows the dialects of English in the 14th century. The linguistic map divides England into 6 dialects: Northern, Kentish, East Midlands, West Midlands and Southern. You can see that the East Midlands in this map is not in the same place as it is in the modern map. This explains why in a previous video, when I mentioned that standard Southern British English was based on the English of the East Midlands around the towns of Cambridge and Oxford, I got a lot of grief. Oxford and Cambridge and London are the East Midlands? That's a surprise to me, as well as I suspect to many people who have seen a map. The East Midlands is Nottingham, Leicester, Derby, Northants, etc. I think you're confusing the East Midlands with the home counties. East Midlands is not Oxford or Cambridge. It is Rugby, Northampton, Kidderminster, etc. Anyway, this map is a simplification during the Middle English period. Just as today, there were a huge array of accents across England.
And as you can see, the map roughly reflects the tribal divisions of the Heptarchy in the map I showed you earlier.
So in this video, when I speak of the East Midlands dialect, I'm talking about the region in the historical linguistic map and not the modern day East Midlands.
Over the centuries, this variety of English evolved into what we refer to today as SSBE, Standard Southern British English, and it was taken across the oceans where it evolved into General American as well as other versions of English.
With that in mind, let's move on. Let's talk about the Middle English period. Around 1400, the King of England was Henry IV. He was the first king since the Norman conquests of 1066 to have English as a mother tongue. From 1066 until well into the 14th century, the language of the ruling classes of England was French, or rather a dialect of French, which linguists today refer to as Anglo-Norman French. The administration was in French or Latin, but not English. The people who continued to speak English were the peasants. For a number of reasons, which I cover in this video here, This all changed, and by 1400 the ruling classes, the aristocracy, were speaking English in England for the first time in over 300 years. Hooray! But at that time, as we have seen, there were many dialects across England. There was no form of English that was considered the standard. England at that time was like a patchwork of all these different regional dialects. There was little in the way of spelling conventions. People would spell the words according to how they spoke in their local dialect, and the same for the grammar, which differed widely across the country. And of course, this was recognised at the time. And here is a quote from 1530. I'll read with modern English pronunciation.
Our language is also so diverse in itself that the common manner of speaking in English of some country can be understood in some other country of the same land.
Shakespeare's character Edgar portrayed the Kentish dialect in King Lear.
Pause the video if you want to read the full quote.
England was one nation. The language was English. But which English should be used in the administration, in the courts, and later on in printing? English needed standardisation. Spoken English could remain distinct, but there had to be a standard form that could be read across the country. So we're going to look at how the East Midlands dialect emerged as the standard.
And more specifically, the southern part of the East Midlands.
However, it should be noted that when the language got codified, some of the features of the northern dialect won out over the East Midlands dialect, and we'll look at that too. A population centre. The East Midlands dialect was spoken roughly between the rivers Great Ouse and the Thames. This was the most densely populated part of the country at that time. It encompassed some of the largest cities in England, even though they are tiny by modern standards. In 1377, London had a population of around 37,000. Norwich in East Anglia had a population of around 6,000. The East Midlands dialect also included the universities, cities Oxford and Cambridge. The Chancery Standard. The City of London covers about 1 square mile and was originally a London city called Londinium. The centre of government in England was and still is in Westminster, just west of the City of London. While laws were passed in Parliament, the courts and all kinds of legal documents, writs, patents, laws, settlements of disputes were written by the scribes at the Chancery. The English they used was known as the Chancery Standard. Until 1430, the clerks in the Chancery wrote documents in French or Latin, but with the emergence of English as the undisputed language of England, the administration switched to English. And these official documents were sent across England. They used the standard spelling. For example, they adopted the SH for sh in words like shall and should instead of the SCH, which was used in Old English, or even an X, which was used sometimes by northern scribes. They spelt such like this and not like this, as Chaucer had done, and they preferred give to Chaucer's yeave and not to Chaucer's nat. Rules for grammar were laid down, and even the handwriting was standardised. It was known as Chancery Hand. Here's an example written by Henry V. Though he plays an important part in this story, we'll return to him in a moment. And to be clear, you couldn't write in your own handwriting style. No, each letter, each stroke, each dot had to be written in what is known as Chancery Hand. Samuel Pepys tells a story of him trekking across Westminster, desperately trying to find someone who could write a bill for him in Chancery Hand. You would think that he could just write the bill himself, but no, it had to be written by a highly skilled scribe who knew Chancery Hand. I mentioned Henry V, and those of you who know English history will know that he led England to a famous victory at the Battle of Agincourt in 1414, subject of a famous play by Shakespeare.
We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. For he today that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother, be he ne'er so base. And gentlemen in England now abed shall think themselves accursed they were not here, and hold their manhoods cheap, while any speaks that fought with us upon St. Crispin's Day.
But perhaps you don't know Henry V's contribution to the English language. While he was on campaign, he wrote his letters home in English, the first king to do so in 350 years. He wrote in the East Midland dialect. It's one of the reasons why the Chancery chose this variety as the standard form. There were other forms of English that might have been chosen as standard, such as the English by Geoffrey Chaucer, who also wrote in East Midlands English, but it was more specifically the version from London. But the version used by the king had royal prestige and it won out. By the time William Caxton set up England's first printing press in 1476 from his workshop also in Westminster, choosing the Chancery standard was the natural choice. Caxton was no stranger to the complexities of printing in English, to a nation whose dialects were not always mutually comprehensible. In the 1490 edition of the prologue to Virgil's Aeneid, Caxton recounts a tale of a merchant from the north of England who wants to buy eggs from a woman in the south of England, and his accent is so unfamiliar to her that she thinks he is speaking French, and he says,
"And specially he asked after eggs, and the good wife answered that she could speak no French. And the merchant was angry, for he also could speak no French, but would have had eggs. And she understood him not. And then, at last, another said that he would have Aaron. Then the good wife said that she understood him well."
In the south of England, the word eggs was Aaron. Aaron comes from Old English. Eggs is a word from Old Norse, the language of the Vikings, and it was used in the north of England, but later became the word used throughout the country. As England grew richer, more people migrated to London, which became a centre for commerce and trade. In London, you'd find merchants, artisans, craftsmen, labourers. Shakespeare came from Stratford upon Avon in the Midlands, and he came to work in the theatre in London. So you would have found many regional varieties of English in London. Although the East Midlands dialect was chosen as the standard variety of England, the fact that London had a mixed population could partly explain why standard English now also includes many features from other parts of the country. So let's have a look at the influence of the northern dialect on standard English. The third person singular S was originally from the northern variety of English. If you ever read any Shakespeare, you'll know that he usually uses a th with the third person singular. For example, the lady doth protest too much. And also you'll find that form in the King James Bible of 1611. For example, the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. Doth, giveth, taketh, maketh, speaketh were southern forms that eventually got replaced by has, gives, takes, makes, speaks, etc. The F form eventually died out sometime in the 17th century.
Plural pronouns. They, them and their were originally the plural pronouns of the north and come from Old Norse. The equivalents in the south and the Midlands were he, him and hera, which come from Old English. You see the problem here. Hey sounds too similar to he. Hame sounds a little too similar to him. Utterly confusing. By the time of Chaucer, they had already replaced hey.
By 1500, hem and here had virtually disappeared.
In Middle English, plural nouns could either be formed with en, as we still do today, with children, oxen, brethren. Shakespeare used shoon as the plural of shoe, or with S, books, clocks, rivers, walls, etc. The plural with S was more prevalent in the north, and it eventually became the standard form.
In the north of England, adverbs were formed with ly, as we do today, slowly, happily. In the south and parts of the East Midlands, they continued to use lish, the old English adverbial ending, slowlish, happylish. Although the L form was gaining ground, it was Henry V who adopted it in his correspondence, and his influence helped push it into a wider, more formal use. When the first waves of colonisation of America took place in the 17th century, the East Midlands variety was already established as the standard written and spoken form. Many of the early colonists were from London and southern England. There's been 300 years of divergence, during which time there have been waves of immigration from Britain and Ireland, not to mention the rest of the world, but standard American English still clings on to some of the vowel sounds from the first wave of immigrants who spoke East Midlands English. Listen to these. I'll give you the words in standard English and in American English
and a Northern English dialect, and you can make up your own mind which it's closer to. But,
But,
blood,
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 stone,
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 no,
No.
No.
maid.
made,
Made.
Of course, I'm cherry picking a little bit. Not all the vowels match up like that. Path.
path,
path,
but you get my point.
And of course, both accents have evolved and diverged over the last 300 years. For example, in the south of England, we used to pronounce the R's after a vowel. It was a rhotic accent. We used to say mother, bird, murder, but not anymore. Now we say mother, bird, murder, but most American accents have retained the rhotic accent.
mother, bird, murder,
But in spite of that, Southern British and Standard American are still mutually intelligible. English teachers, including myself, tend to focus on the differences between the two accents, but it's remarkable how similar Standard American and Standard British are after 300 years of separation. That's because they all come from this same East Midlands dialect. And that's true of other writers of English too, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, which I mentioned more in other videos. Of the 1.5 billion people in the world who speak English, at least 1.45 billion speak the English of the East Midlands variety. So that probably includes you. If you're interested in the history of the English language, then do sign up to my newsletter, The Rambler, link in the description. It's free, or become a Patreon. Wisdom guaranteed. That's all for now. See you soon.